My name is Kate Tully, and I am an Associate Professor of Agroecology at the University of Maryland. And an agroecologist is somebody who looks at agricultural systems through the lens of ecology. So using all the principles of ecology like species interactions and biogeochemical cycling and understanding abiotic and biotic factors to then try to create systems that are more sustainable in terms of how we produce our food. I have two threads of research. On one side, I'm looking at really large-scale agricultural systems and trying to increase the adoption of cover crops. So cover crops we grow a lot of them in Maryland, and we actually subsidize the growing of cover crops. It's basically like a service crop. So you don't necessarily derive any financial benefit from it, but what you do is if you plant it in the fall when your corn crop, say, is done, it can take up any nutrients like nitrogen that's left in the soil, and it can hold it in its biomass over the course of the winter and then even into the spring. And then those nutrients can then be released after the cover crop dies to that subsequent cash crop. So it's kind of a way of tightening nutrient cycling in our agricultural systems. And so I look at, as a biogeochemist, that's sort of like my other hat that I wear. I always am thinking about nutrient cycling. So, and then the other project I did was on saltwater intrusion and the impact that phenomenon is having on eutrophication. And so, in a nutshell, sea level rise rates are very high on the eastern seaboard of the United States. They're 3 times the global average. And a sort of almost like a precursor to sea level rise is saltwater intrusion. It kind of happens before a field, for instance, is 100% flooded. And you can imagine that, adding salty water to anything changes the chemistry, right? It changes the chemistry of your drinking water. It's going to change the chemistry of your farm field. And so, unfortunately, when that happens in an agricultural system, it can basically kind of unlock the nitrogen and phosphorus that was in the soil. And then that could be transported downstream and end up polluting the Chesapeake Bay. Before I came to Maryland, I had a postdoctoral position at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, but I lived almost 100% of the time, not quite, but very close, in East Africa. So I lived and worked in Kenya and Tanzania. In both of those countries, I had set up research farms, kind of similar to the work I do here, but obviously a very different system. And I was just trying to understand how we could increase crop productivity and at the same time not sort of repeat the past, or repeat the mistakes that we have made in our agricultural systems in the US, which is just dump a bunch of fertilizer on it. But at the same time, the crop yields in Tanzania and Kenya are about 1/10 of what they are here in the United States. But 100% of the corn crop there goes to feed people. So trying to look at this from a food security perspective. So that's what I did there, and it was an amazing opportunity. I have millions of stories about black mambas and crazy baboons. I led a course in Kenya in the highlands for Columbia and Princeton undergrads when I was there, and that was pretty fun. So I grew up in California, and my dad is a huge gardener. We still swap pictures this is what my tomatoes are doing. And so I always loved agriculture, but I actually thought I was going to be a poet. So I went to college at a small liberal arts school that had a really strong English department and creative writing department. So I got there and I was like, I'm going to be an English major. I went to Kenyon College in Ohio, which is it's very well known within the smaller schools for its literary magazine. I worked for this, the Kenyon Review when I was in college, and I was like, I'm going to be a writer. And then I went abroad my junior year to Costa Rica. And I grew up in California, so I grew up sort of speaking Spanish, and then I decided to double major in English and Spanish. And I was like, okay, so doing my Spanish, and then I was like, I'm gonna go abroad to Costa Rica. And I'll get to use my Spanish, and I'm gonna go on this thing. It was like a sustainable ag. It just so happened that it was sustainable ag focus, and I just like totally fell in love with the concept of agroecology. Because I love being outside and I love nature, but I also love growing food. And I was like, oh my gosh, these things can be done together. And I came back and I had this like real crisis. So I was like, what am I going to do with my life? So then I decided to triple major. So I added environmental science to my list. So when I graduated, I still didn't really know what I was going to do, but I felt myself. I took a year off, and then I realized like what I really wanted to do was like work and do research that was, you know, focusing on improving our food systems and making them more sustainable. And here I am. So first of all, I love my job. Being a professor is great because it's a really good fit for me because I love teaching. So I love interacting with students. I love mentoring students. I really love that I get to work with graduate students and like watch them like, you know, blossom into like really independent thinkers. And then I love that I just get paid to use my brain. You know, like I can have an idea and I can like think about it and read a bunch about it, and then I can like say, hey, I want to like ask this question or look into this, you know, phenomenon. And if I write a good enough grant proposal, then I can actually like get paid to go and do it. So I love a lot of aspects of my job, but I especially appreciate the intellectual freedom. You know, I think that at least the work that I do, you can bring a lot of your like personal, like other skills, like into your science. So I love talking to people, and like, so I've always worked very closely with farmers. Like I ask them what they're interested in or phenomenons that they've been observing. And so I think one thing that surprised me was like, you don't just have to be good at like crunching numbers. If you're really interested in the natural world, you can find a way into, you know, into science and into agroecology. So I was actually, you know, surprised by how much a lot of my other skills like I was able to bring them to bear on my science. There's a lot of paperwork and administration involved when you get to the higher levels of being a professor. So, you know, you don't always see that. And that's not always my favorite part. Like I like doing the science. I don't like filling out paperwork. I get up really early. I teach yoga and I practice yoga. So like I'm a very big proponent of like making sure that you take care of your mental health and your physical health outside of doing, you know, all of the science that we do. So I do that. And then before the pandemic, I will metro to work. Depending on the day, I would, you know, be doing a lot of work like reading papers or grading papers if I'm working on my student stuff. And then I teach 2 different courses. So I teach global food systems in the spring, and we look at all sorts of things like food waste and sustainable ag systems around the world, and you know, equity or in lack of equity in the food system and things like that. And then in the fall, I teach agroecology, which is like what we've been talking about. So I teach that class, and so I would like go and I would teach a class, and then I would come back, and then I would probably be reading more papers and grading papers and doing admin stuff. That's during the school year. During the summer, I'm in the field a lot. So I go down and I collect data, water samples, soil samples, plant samples, and then as I was saying, I'm a biogeochemist, so I'm going to look at nutrients in those. So I would look at like nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon. I think you have to be very dedicated to setting a good work-life balance. When you first start as a professor, for instance, it's really hard to draw boundaries because there's so much expected of you and the stakes are so high. Like you're really trying to get tenure, you're trying to find graduate students, you have to work really hard at it. So my first couple years, like I definitely didn't get a lot of sleep. I always exercised, but I didn't get as much sleep as I do now. Now I'm like really better about like trying to go to bed at a certain time, and I do think it takes dedication. It's something that I try to promote in my students as well, like trying to make sure that they have, you know, some sort of exercise routine. There's so many studies that show that like endorphins and like making sure that you stay physically active keeps all the brain juices flowing. Yeah. And I love that about the work that I do. I sometimes joke that like, I see myself as like a connector. Like I cannot do the work I want to do by myself, but I know who can do it and who can do it well. So like, I'll find people who I can like connect and be like, you two should work together on this. I think what's wonderful about agroecology is that we're all working towards this like common goal of like trying to improve sustainable ag systems. And so there's not a lot of like rivalry. I mean, we're all competing for money from the government for these projects, but it doesn't feel the same as like, there's not an intellectual competition, right? So it's much more collaborative. Well, it's a new field, so you can make whatever you want of it. You know, like you can be an agroecologist and love insects, right? You can be like, I want to look at positive insect interactions. So you know, a lot of people who are interested in just general ecology, where you're looking at sort of natural systems, I think it can be blended pretty easily now into agroecology. And I just say that it's like a really exciting field where you get to, you know, you get to work with farmers who are great and produce the food that we eat and like keep us alive. And then you also get to ask like really cool questions. And I love that it's like, it feels very practical. That's like, I feel like I'm making a difference in my research. It's a great, worthwhile discipline to work in, and the people are great. So I highly recommend people becoming agroecologists. Gosh, you know, I wish I had a crystal ball. One that I'm seeing that's like we're on the precipice of, at least, is with all of the sensor technology now, like, you know, we've just, you know, you can have moisture sensors that can tell you really detailed information. And so for instance, like, this is not work that I do, but it's work that a colleague does, and I use this example because it's like very tangible. But like, imagine a situation where you're trying to like water your strawberries, and you don't want to overwater them, right? Because it's wasting water. But you're not like, but you can't be out there like personally testing the soil to like figure out. So now there are all these sensors that you can use. They basically can be like, hey, it's dry, and that can send a signal to like a, you know, like a cloud-based computing platform that's like, okay, time to turn on the irrigation. And then your strawberries will get watered, and then the sensor will be like, okay, cool, that's enough, like we're good, and then it will shut it off. We call this like precision agriculture. And so as our sensor technology and just like data computing, you know, systems have expanded, it's really expanded like our ability to use like IT and technology in agriculture. So I see that as being something that we're like technologically just starting to see the implications of, which I think is really, really cool. You know, of course, like something that I'm thinking about because of the pandemic that is not technological, but is just sort of more like, I do see people turning more and more towards the importance of focusing on food security and food access and food justice. Finally, agroecology actually had its roots as a peasant movement. So it really was like a social movement before it was such a science. And so I'm really excited to see that more people thinking about how we can make our food systems more sustainable for everybody, not just for, you know, those of us who can shop at Whole Foods.